Dr. Perry, I'm going to move to the question of viral inactivation now, heat treatment work. This has been largely covered in the evidence of Dr. Peter Foster, so I'm not going to go through the detail of it at all with you. I have a handful of general questions which reflect, I think it's probably fair to say, concerns of some core participants or issues which some core participants have asked to raise. So the first question is this. What was your understanding of the weight attached to viral inactivation as a research and development goal for PFC in 1981, 1982? In other words, how much of a priority was it for the PFC at that stage?
I think it was top priority by 81, 82.
In terms of the establishment of the Factor VIII study group, do you know of any reason why that couldn't have been set up earlier than it was?
No, I don't think there's a particularly good reason why it couldn't have been set up sooner. I think it was set up when I think the body of evidence and opinion and so on drew us to the conclusion that it was necessary, and it was necessary to draw upon not just PFC resources, but the wider resources of SMBTS to address the issues. And it wasn't just about virus inactivation, the Factor VIII study group. It was about maintaining self-sufficiency as well.
Can I then ask you about one passage in your witness statement, WITN 6920001, and if we could go to page 37, please, Sally. So in paragraph 106, having referred to the work of the Factor VIII study group, you say the PFC continued to research and progress methods for pasteurisation of Factor VIII as its preferred option. You refer to the development of in-house methods for testing the efficacy of inactivation processes, and then say this: there remained concern, including internationally, that the modification of Factor VIII manufacturing processes to include steps for virus inactivation could lead to the development of inhibitors in recipient patients, leading to potentially catastrophic consequences for the treatment of haemophilia. And the question arising out of that, Dr. Perry, is this: what weight was given to that hypothetical theory as opposed to the known real risk of hepatitis, which equally could lead to catastrophic consequences?
Well, I think there was very significant weight. It wasn't completely hypothetical either. I think it was based on, admittedly, a rather scant knowledge of the Factor VIII molecule and what heat might do to it, and the consequences that it might have in invoking or potentiating inhibitors in patients. It was a very serious risk. I wouldn't describe it as a hypothetical risk. Indeed, latterly there were a couple of organisations, I think the Dutch Red Cross, the CLB as it was then, and Octapharma did actually produce heat-treated product, which generated very high levels of inhibitors in a large number of patients. So it was a very real risk. I think that post-dated 81, 82, but it was still, it had still been identified as a risk then. And I think part of the Factor VIII study group actually tried to develop ways of examining whether there was any physical damage to Factor VIII after it had been subjected to a heat treatment process. Excuse me.
Now, more generally, it might be said in relation to the work of PFL and BPL, having regard to the evidence the inquiries examined from Dr. Smith and Dr. Lane, that the work on heat treatment, whether pasteurised or dry heat, which had been started because of a desire to address non-A, non-B hepatitis, was really given urgency, galvanised by the advent of AIDS, and it was that which injected a greater sense of urgency into the work that was being undertaken. That might be a submission that's advanced. Is the same point applicable to the work of the PFC, that it was AIDS that injected a real sense of urgency, and at a relatively late stage, rather than and perhaps a greater sense of urgency having been engendered by non-A, non-B?
It was certainly the case that the major concern when this group was set up in 1982 was how to address the universal risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis by its coagulation factors. And I think it's probably true to say that following the events in late 1984, did inject a much, I don't know how best to express it, a substantially greater sense of urgency and also slight change of direction. This became the target, HIV, not non-A, non-B hepatitis anymore.
Again, this is a question I've particularly been asked to put to you, Dr. Perry. Why did it take patients in Scotland being infected with HIV to bring about this change of direction and this greater sense of urgency?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think our work on non-A, non-B hepatitis was still very valid during if we talk about the period of 1984, for instance, leading up to the patient cohort in Edinburgh. There was, I think, as I say, there are a number of factors. We didn't, nobody knew what it hadn't been discovered or identified or isolated the HIV virus or the HTLV3 virus. We didn't know its physical characteristics. We didn't know whether heat treatment would do anything for it at all. There was the risk of inhibitors, which was very real, and we had correspondence, or Professor Cash certainly had correspondence with a number of haemophilia doctors who advised him that they were very concerned. Professor Ludlam was one of them, about the risk of inhibitors following the application of heat treatment and the need for really quite extensive and probably quite lengthy clinical trials before it was introduced. So I think those two main factors, and I think had we suggested, this is my own view, had it been proposed to introduce heat treatment in 1984, for instance, at the beginning of 1984, in a similar way to which we did in late 1984, I'm far from convinced that would have enjoyed the support of haemophilia doctors, because I think they might have regarded it as premature. They had no evidence that patients were or had been infected with HIV at that stage.
And then can I just ask you to help with one particular document from November 1984, PRSE 0004148. So it's a meeting chaired by you, Dr. Perry, on the 13th of November 1984.
Yes.
Minutes of a meeting of heads of department / section managers. So it's an internal PFC meeting, is that right?
It's a local management team meeting, yes.
And if we go to the second page, towards the top of the page, under the heading AIDS Minute, the minutes record as follows. Dr. Perry advised the meeting that as a result of the amount of information being publicised through the press on the subject of AIDS, there was an immediate requirement for PFC to render all factor VIII free from HTLV3 virus. And then there's an explanation of the work that was being undertaken to that end.
Yes.
Now that might be said to read as though this sense of urgency, this change of direction in the autumn of 1984 is because of publicity. That's how it reads. Are you able to assist us with that?
I agree. It could be interpreted like that. I didn't write the minute of the meeting, but I would have approved them. I think it was. I think the minutes were tended to be written by the head of the administration department in PFC. But it is certainly the case that the impetus and the momentum and the requirement for inactivation wasn't simply to do with publicity. It was, as I say, the devastating news received earlier that month of the transmission episode.
I then want to move beyond 1984 into 1985 and in particular 1986, if we get to, as it were, 1986, I think it's right to say that in terms of domestic factor VIII concentrates, there are two products, both of which inactivate HIV. That's BPL's 8Y product and PFC's NY product.
Yes.
8Y inactivated non-A, non-B hepatitis. NY did not. That's correct, isn't it? I'll leave aside the question of when that became known.
I don't think it was certain at the beginning of 86 that 8Y was effective against non-A, non-B, but there was there was reason for optimism, I think.
Yes, I'll come on to, as it were, date of knowledge in a moment. But on any view, that's correct as a matter of fact, I think. 8Y had that advantage over NY.
At that point in time, yes.
Yes. Obviously,
yes,
PFC
indeed.
then introduced Z8
Yes,
in 1987, and Z8 did inactivate non-A, non-B hepatitis.
But that conclusion can only be drawn with hindsight, as it were.
Well, what I want to do is just look at what was known and what was happening at the time then, so that we avoid hindsight. So if we just perhaps pick it up at PRSC 0001258, so we can see, this is, again, one of your statements to the Penrose inquiry. If we just go a little further down the page, please, Sally. So below the passage or the question in italics, you say, I am unable to precisely identify the date on which the SMBTS/PFC first became aware of the BPL-PFL-8Y development. Then you refer to a paper put together by Dr. Foster, which you say indicates that we were first briefed by Dr. Smith on the 8Y developments in February 1985. If we then go over the page, you refer to the clinical trial of 8Y commencing around April 1985. And then if we pick it up in the second paragraph, you say this: therefore, although early results in a relatively small group of patients were reported by Dr. Ritzer as encouraging. Now, just pausing there, can you recall when that was being reported by Dr. Ritzer?
No, I can't recall the date, but it would have obviously predated March 1986.
Yes.
It might have been late 1985.
Yeah, my understanding is it was 1985, but I'm afraid I've mislaid the reference, which gave me a precise date.
Yeah. It was probably in a study that didn't quite meet the international guidelines for conducting these studies.
And I'm sure we can check that in any event. But you then continue, it was not until the interim review point in this study, March 1986, reported in October 1986 to the UK HCDO, that the freedom of non-A, non-B hepatitis, I'll skip over hepatitis B or HTLV3, would have been described as likely. So now that at first blush makes it sound as though the point in time at which it would have been regarded that 8Y was likely not to transmit non-A, non-B hepatitis was when the results were published in October 1986. But I think it's right that you would have been aware of the interim results in March of 1986. Is that correct?
I think so, yes, absolutely.
And I think we can just look briefly at the meeting, PRSE 0003764. So it's a note of a meeting held at PFC on the 17th of March 1986. We can see that there are a range of representatives from BPL and a range of representatives from SNBTS present. If we go to the third page, please, Sally, we can see this is your note of the meeting, 24th of March 1986, and it's paragraph 5 on this page, in which we see Dr. Smith outlined clinical trial results of the 8Y factor VIII products so far. While results cannot be considered conclusive at this stage, he indicated that no cases of virus infection have occurred attributable to 8Y material after 12 months' experience of 8Y in virgin haemophiliacs. So that's the significance, I think, of March of 1986. Is that right?
I think that's correct, yes.
The earlier indications have been promising, but this was a greater degree of confirmation, albeit it obviously fell short of conclusive.
Yes, I think it became likely at this stage. I think my views of these reports was more optimistic than Dr. Smith's. Actually, he was always very cautious not to overestimate or be too optimistic about outcomes before the data was confirming it.
So, by March 1986. Or by the date of this meeting, by the time of this meeting in March 1986, you and your colleagues within Scotland, if we just go back to the list of attenders on the first page, so we have a range of colleagues there, though I'm not sure whether we can tell if all of them were present for the whole of the meeting. For the relevant part of the meeting, but in any event, you and your colleagues would know that there was a good chance, if I can put it that way, that 8Y was successful in terms of not transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes.
And at that time, in terms of NY, the feeling was it did transmit non-A, non-B hepatitis.
I'm not sure that we had any data on that, but we had no reason to expect 24 hours at 68 degrees to inactivate non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Now, what I want to do next then is just go through a chain of correspondence in June, July and August involving the efforts made to obtain some 8Y from BPL for use in virgin haemophiliacs or minimally treated patients. So if we start with PRSE 00038845, and what I'm going to do, Dr. Perry, is go through the correspondence and then ask you some questions about it. So we can see this is Dr. Bolton to you, 27th of June 1986, passing on some comments from Dr. Ludlam. And the first main paragraph reads, it's the second paragraph, a young haemophiliac who previously had minimal haemotherapy with factor 8 received an infusion of the current heat-treated product a month ago. He now shows signs of liver enzyme rises indicating non-A, non-B hepatitis. Christopher is a bit ruthful with his own staff about this because he feels that this patient should have received 8Y or an equivalent product. So I think that's the first communication with you on this particular issue.
On this topic, yes, yeah.
And then if we go to PRSE 00033030, please. You responded to Dr. Bolton on the 2nd of July 1986. If we look at the text of the letter, so you don't deal with the particular case that has been flagged up, but you say in the second and third paragraphs that the PFC is, you say, poised to introduce another factor 8 product. I'm not sure whether, I think it's April 1987 by which time you actually...
But I think our expectation and our plan at that time would have been available by September, I think.
But in any event, what you're doing is flagging up that there will be a PFC product,
a comparable
equivalent
product.
to 8Y,
sure.
in due course.
Yeah.
If we then go, please, to PRSE 00011784, we can see Dr. Bolton wrote to you on the 4th of July 1986, and it refers to a telephone conversation that the two of you had had the previous day, and then the attached record of the conversation is actually on a different reference, PRSE 00027883. We turn the document round, please. Now, I think that the most of this page, as I understand it, Dr. Perry, is describing the intended progression towards the release of the PFC's own new product, Z8. Is that right?
Yes, I think the phase 2 product refers to the 68 degrees for 24 hours, and phase 3 refers to Z8.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we can see a time scale being given in relation to that, which I don't need to trouble you with. But the bottom of the page says this: in the meantime, any Edinburgh Virgin haemophiliacs requiring therapy could be given BPL 8Y. So is it right to understand from this note, you and Dr. Bolton have had a conversation on the 3rd of July, and part of the conversation involves a plan for 8Y to be given to any virgin haemophiliacs who may require treatment?
Yes. Yes.
And so I think we see that then picked up next in a letter at PRSE 0004097. This is, again, Dr. Bolton, to you, 7th of July. Sorry to be pestering you again. Last week, Dr. Ludlam wrote to Brian, that's presumably Dr. McClelland,
Yes.
asking if it would be possible to obtain some of the BPL products for use if a previously untreated haemophiliac presented for replacement therapy. And then the letter continues by a discussion of how much, and Dr. Bolton says he thinks the amount that Dr. Ludlam had suggested might be too much, essentially. Yeah. If we just look at the whole letter, please, Sally. And in the last paragraph, Dr. Bolton says to you, would it be possible for you to obtain perhaps 10,000 units, i.e. 50 vials?
Yes.
So that's the 7th of July. And then if we go to PRSE 0003814, we can see a letter of the same date from you back to Dr. Bolton. You're responding to the note, the handwritten note, I'm assuming is what's referred to in the first paragraph. And then you say in paragraph B, while there'll be no PFC product virucidally comparable to 8Y until September 86, and then you refer to the phase 3 product, and then you say this: however, in the immediate future, July to September 1986, we could probably get supplies of 8Y for special cases. It would, of course, be preferable if these were obtained and supplied through PFC. Why would it be preferable for them to be obtained and supplied through PFC?
With hindsight, I'm not sure, actually. Perhaps I felt that it would just have fitted in with the distribution system, and we could have held the stock at PFC.
In any event, is it right to understand that this is a suggestion that in the intervening period before the PFC equivalent is capable of being available, rolled out, you think you'll be able to get supplies of 8Y for what's described as special cases?
In response to a specific request by a haemophilia director, yes.
And by special cases, I assume that's meaning minimally or previously untreated patients?
I think it would be, yes, exactly those two categories of patients, yeah. My understanding is the guideline, the guidance produced by UKHCDO at that time did have a prescribed policy for minimally treated patients or previously untreated patients, which was the use of cryoprecipitate. So that was the standard treatment for those groups of patients. That's my understanding.
If we then go, please, to PRSC 0004383, we can see that you wrote on the 10th of July to Mr. Pettit at BPL. First paragraph of the letter refers to very occasionally a haemophiliac without previous exposure to factor VIII concentrate presents in Scotland for treatment. You refer to one such patient presenting very recently, being treated with the current product and subsequently developing markers for non-A, non-B hepatitis. You then refer to the intention to introduce PFC's own product in due course. And then the second paragraph, pending the introduction of this product in Scotland and Northern Ireland, I write to ask if it would be possible for you to supply PFC with a very modest quantity of 8Y 50 vials to cover the treatment of similar virgin patients who may appear between now and September. This request originated from our own haemophilia directors, and in the light of our imminent introduction of a product comparable to 8Y, does not seem unreasonable, should not place an overwhelming burden on your supply. I think that's you to Mr. Pettit on the 10th of July. And then if we go to PRSE 00001397, it appears that you wrote to Dr. Smith at PFL on the 24th of July, referring to a discussion you'd had and asking for a supply of 50 vials of 8Y as a contingency in the event that a virgin haemophiliac presents for treatment. You say it will be issued on condition that the clinical trial protocol is observed. What would that entail, the clinical trial protocol?
I think there's a little correspondence in between this where Mr. Pettit wrote back to me and said he'd discussed it with Dr. Lane and he'd discussed it with Dr. Smith. This was an unlicensed product and they could assist. They thought it was a reasonable request, but what they would prefer was a slightly more win-win situation where if we did have a previously untreated patient, they could be entered into the trial, the clinical trial of 8Y, which was ongoing to study the absence of infectivity in that product.
And I think that's probably a reference to a letter of the same date, but it essentially crossed with yours, from Mr. Pettit to you, PRSE 00003693. Where he says, following your letter on your requirements of virgin haemophiliacs in Scotland and Northern Ireland, I tried to contact you by telephone last Thursday in order to begin supply as soon as possible. And then the next paragraph refers to Dr. Lane's agreement. I've spoken to Dr. Jim Smith. He hoped to see you last Friday with a novel proposal. Perhaps Scotland would like to participate in our trial of Factor 8. Provided you were agreeable that the patients met the criteria and given agreement by the haemophilia directors involved, Jim can provide 8Y from batches set aside for trial purposes. And then the next paragraph says, in case there are some patients who do not strictly meet the criteria for trial now or in the future, I have put aside some 8Y for immediate dispatch to PFC or any other destination if you require it. I can arrange same-day delivery if necessary. Would you like this additional product to be sent to PFC now, or have you made adequate arrangements for cover with Jim? So that letter reads as though saying there are two routes to getting 8Y, a small supply of 8Y for Scotland. There's the proposal that any Scottish or Northern Irish patient who might need it could be entered in the trial and get 8Y that way.
Yes.
And then Mr. Pettit saying, but we can also put aside some 8Y for you and send it to you by same-day delivery.
Yes, if there were similar patients that didn't quite meet the criteria for entry into the trial, they weren't going to be too rigid about which patients should be used for.
And then we can see that at PRSE 00003143, now, you wouldn't have received the letter we've just looked at because these are all letters written on the same date, so I suspect you wouldn't.
Okay.
You might have had the earlier letters. But this is you writing to Dr. Bolton, 24th of July. I've now confirmed that BPL are happy to supply 50 vials of 8Y to PFC on the understanding that in the event that the material is used in suitable virgin patients, appropriate serial samples would be taken to contribute to their overall infectivity study. So that's 24th of July. And then just to complete the chain of correspondence, if we go to PRSE 00004146, this is you now responding to Mr. Pettit's letter of the 24th of July. You're writing on the 28th of July. You confirm, if we just zoom in on the text, Sally. Thank you. You confirmed that you've spoken to Jim Smith. You've confirmed locally that the supply of 8Y should be conditional on users participating in the clinical trial. And you've asked if someone can send, if Jim can send immediately 50 vials as a contingency stock of non-infective material in the unlikely event that a virgin haemophiliac presents for treatment in the near future. And then we can see, if we then go to PRSE 0002616, here's Dr. Smith sending 50 vials of 8Y on the 1st of August 1986 to you. And then PRSE 0002643. We can see on the 5th of August, you wrote to Dr. Bolton, you told him the 8Y had arrived, and you've sent 20 vials to the Regional Transfusion Centre in Edinburgh, and you say there's more here if you need it. Now, is it fair to say, having regard to that correspondence, that certainly once the issue had been raised with you, it was fairly simple and straightforward for you to obtain a supply of 8Y from BPL?
I think the incident that triggered this was the one that you described in, or the one that was described in Dr. Bolton's original letter, and I guess I set out on this short journey, not necessarily with an expectation it would be successful. I think factor 8 was in short supply in England, and 50 vials for Scotland would mean 50 vial less for England, and those sorts of considerations. So I was quite surprised, but also delighted when they responded so positively. And I guess in Jim Smith's usual way, he found quite an elegant way of dealing with this, which was providing product, and if it was a previously untreated patient or somebody that met the criteria for entry into the trial, then it would be a good way of meeting the clinical need, but also supplementing the data that they had for their clinical study.
Now, we can see from from the document on screen, having received the 50 vials from England, you sent out 20 to Edinburgh, and obviously Dr. Bolton knew what the plan was because you'd been having these earlier discussions
Sure.
with him, and we saw the handwritten note of your conversation from early July. Did you notify other regions that there was a small supply of 8Y in stock in case they had a virgin haemophiliac or minimally treated haemophiliac?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Should you have done?
I'm not. This topic was discussed in the Penrose inquiry, and I'm not suggesting that's not a reason to discuss it here. I think my understanding and my response to this particular request was that we were responding to a specific request from a specific haemophilia director, and although I framed the correspondence with BPL to reflect a Scotland-wide potential requirement, it was designed to maximise the chances of success of getting this product for Scotland. I think with hindsight, what should have happened, or maybe I can go on to explain why I didn't. It was not a licensed product. I think if another haemophilia director in Scotland had requested a similar product for treatment, then I would have acted in the same way and sought further supplies. But my view at that time, which wasn't an overly hard view, but it was that the fractionator or the manufacturer has no business in selecting products for treating specific groups of patients. That's a doctor's job. And what I was doing on this occasion was responding to a legitimate request from a close haemophilia director colleague, and there for me, I think the matter rested, and also the issue about not being seen to promote unlicensed products. And if I'd have started broadcasting to all the haemophilia directors in Scotland that we have this product available, should you need it, that could be interpreted as promotion of a particular product, an unlicensed product. My view with hindsight, and I've reflected not only during the Penrose inquiry, but subsequently on this topic, because it started out as a relatively small a response to an individual request from a haemophilia doctor. It was not a major issue for me, and you're right, it went very smoothly in the end. I think what should have happened, or what could have happened, is on a UK-wide basis, because there was this difference in availability, or 8Y was proving to be a world-class product capable of inactivating not only HIV, but non-A, non-B hepatitis. It seems to me, and this is with hindsight, but it's still a valid view, that the UK HCDO organisation, if they'd have recognised that, it would not have been difficult for them to come up with a policy which may have had to involve discussions with PFC and BPL for identifying, for any patients in the UK that were appropriate, that were previously untreated, whether they're in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales or England, to access 8Y. And an operational arrangement could have been made so that the 8Y that was used, for instance, for treatment of patients in Scotland, could have been replaced with some PFC product for routinely treated severe haemophiliacs in England. And I think that would have been possible. I think a bit like the batch dedication, it was a lost opportunity. It would have only appropriately come, I think, from the Haemophilia Doctors Organisation, because they had the knowledge, they knew how many patients there were likely to be, and I think that would have been well received. As it was, my response was limited to a particular response to a particular request from a doctor. I think the other big centre in Scotland where it was likely was that a previously untreated patient would emerge was in Glasgow in the west of Scotland, and Dr. Forbes, I think, was the director of that centre at the time, and he was chairman of the UK HCDO at that time as well. So he would also have been very aware of the data on 8Y, and could and perhaps should have made a similar request, but in the event he didn't, it could be that he chose to continue using cryoprecipitate for such cases, because that was the official UK HCDO guideline at the time, I think.
Did you have any direct discussions with Dr. Ludlam yourself on this issue in 1986?
I don't think I did. I think it was. It wasn't always done like this, but I think this arrangement was brought about via Dr. Bolton. He was the, if you like, the go-between between Professor Ludlam and myself.
And does that reflect, I think, what you told us yesterday, Dr. Cash's preference, that the Haemophilia Centre directors would liaise with the RTCs rather than directly with PFC? So there was this slightly cumbersome route of Dr. Ludlam going to Dr. Bolton, who came to you, and you went to Dr. Smith or Mr. Pettit.
Yes, that's right.
Now, leaving aside the question of whose individual responsibility it might have been, who should have come up with the idea, would you accept this as a general proposition, that it should have been apparent to somebody, to the appropriate bodies in Scotland, whether that's just the Haemophilia Centre directors or SMBTS or both, by March of 1986, well, leave aside for present purposes the earlier periods and Dr. Ritz's early promising signs, but by March 1986, it was known that there was this disparity between, or that there was likely to be a disparity between 8Y and NY. It must have been capable of being foreseen that minimally treated or virgin haemophiliacs might present for treatment, and that therefore somebody, maybe the Haemophilia Centre director should have taken the lead, but somebody should have thought about this rather than for the solution to be triggered by the actual infection of a patient.
Well, I think I would probably agree with you, which is why, with hindsight, I think the ideal outcome would have been for the UK Haemophilia Centres Directors Organisation to, in the knowledge that they had a product which was likely to be non-infective with respect to non-A, non-B, there was an opportunity for wider UK cooperation between Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland and Wales, and that could have been fairly simply put in place. I'm not trying to distance myself. I was in a position, perhaps, to create more influence or to drive this forward. But as I say, these decisions on choice of product for patients were quite well defined for good reason. And as I say, I don't think it was at the front of my mind that it was a PFC responsibility to then circulate a proposal to the haemophilia centres in Scotland that they might wish to consider using 8Y for the treatment of previously untreated patients. That's their business. Professor Cash also took the view that this was perhaps not an appropriate thing to be doing anyway. England and Wales were so short of factor VIII from the NHS that I think he perhaps, I'm not sure why, but he took the view that we shouldn't be stealing resources from England and Wales, which was a slightly extreme view, I think, for the relatively small quantities involved. So that's my view now. And I think it sort of concurs with your view that somebody or some organisation or some part of the network of care for haemophilia could have identified this as an opportunity.
And the way you put it just a little while ago in your evidence was talking about Professor Forbes, that he could have and perhaps should have.
Well, yes, but only in the context of the short discussion we've just had. It's again, and I'm really not trying to distance myself from this, but for me to say that Professor Forbes should have done something in terms of selection of products for its patients is really not my.
Well, I appreciate there are a number of people who might have done something. You happen to be a person who had realised there was something perhaps to be done because of the position that Dr. Ludlam had put you in. Plainly, it was a matter for him to raise too, should he wish to do so. And you could perhaps have spoken informally to Dr. Forbes, or because of his position in the UK HCDO, and said, have you thought of this? It's not my position really to mention it, but it's we're talking about children here. They're the likeliest people to come forward with as newly diagnosed people with haemophilia. Perhaps you might want to discuss whether something can be done about it.
Yeah, indeed, that is the case. I could have done that. I wouldn't want to distance.
And you didn't?
I wouldn't distance myself from that, and I didn't do that. But I think what my more likely position would have been that Dr. Ludlam, who had succeeded in obtaining this product through the good offices of PFC, if you like, and via BPL, I would have thought would have communicated to his fellow haemophilia directors in Scotland, because they met regularly, they discussed issues regularly, they had common problems in terms of previously untreated patients and how best to treat them and so on. So that seemed to me at the time, or subsequent to this issue, a more likely and appropriate mechanism for wider use of this product. I think in the event that the product that we did get never got used for previously untreated patients. I think it was ultimately used for a patient under Dr. Ludlam's care who had an allergic reaction to some other products, and 8Y didn't produce that allergic reaction. So it never got used because previously untreated patients didn't come up very often. And the other factor is that this was only envisaged at the time of it taking place to be in place for about 2 or 3 months, because the PFC equivalent product would have been available then. In the event it was delayed for reasons of clinical trials and so on.
I'm going to move now, Dr. Perry, to a completely different topic. I just want to ask you very briefly, first of all, about your role on the biological subcommittee on the Committee of the Safety of Medicines. Now, I'm not asking you about any particular aspect of the decisions or the committee meetings that you attended between 1986 to 1990. It's just really to ask you to illuminate the process a little. First of all, the confidentiality of meetings of the biological subcommittee, I think described by you in your Penrose evidence as rigorous and formal. So members of the committee were expected not to share information about committee meetings.
This is the Committee on Safety of Medicine. Yes.
Is that right? So you were, there was a high expectation of confidentiality.
I think I had to sign a formal document declaring that I would keep the contents of the meeting and the discussions strictly confidential. And
can you recall how potential conflicts of interest were managed? Because you were, Mr. Watt had been effectively fractionators, producers of blood products at the time of sitting on the meetings. That could be said to give rise to a potential conflict of interest when considering applications or issues relating to similar products produced elsewhere. Was there a system for managing that?
The solution to that very real problem that you described was fairly simple and straightforward, that both myself and Dr. Snape, who was on the committee at the same time, were asked if we would care to resign because of potential conflict of interest. And so when that was recognised, I think it was following the removal of Crown immunity. I think prior to that date, I think the Committee on Safety of Medicines, the biological subcommittee, felt that they needed people who had an expertise in fractionation to advise the Secretariat and the people that assessed product license applications from other organisations to be part of that decision-making process. And I think I was always aware of the conflict of interest, and I was extremely rigorous about never divulging any information or knowledge that I gained from reading a manufacturer's license application. But I think with hindsight, it was probably the correct outcome, that there was a conflict of interest. But certainly during my time on the Committee on Safety of Medicines, I think both Dr. Snape and Dr. Lane, who preceded Dr. Snape on the committee, made a very real contribution to the work of the committee.
And in terms of the issues that were considered at meetings, would it be right to understand that the majority of the consideration would be of actual licence applications or licence renewal applications? Was that
yes,
most of the work?
The way the system worked was perhaps a month before the meeting, a very large bag would arrive at my house with, or it may have come to PFC as the point of delivery, containing the full dossiers that have been submitted by product license holders, and the job was to go through those and then present any views that we might have on safety or quality issues to the committee when it met.
Were there ever, as far as you can recall, subcommittee meetings which were looking, in which sort of ad hoc advice was sought on issues other than licence applications or licence renewals?
A generic issue?
Yes.
No, but I think they did take place. I think they did occur. I can't give any really meaningful examples during my tenure, but they may well have done. But the bulk of the work was to address specific licence applications and so on. But nothing comes to mind regarding more generic considerations.
Now, the next and the sort of final main topic I want to turn to is your role on the Advisory Committee for the Virological Safety of Blood and its consideration of issues relating to the introduction of hepatitis C screening. I just want to ask you, before we look at any particular documents, just for some general assistance with this particular committee. You were on it from its inception, and the first meeting was April 1989. Did you gain any understanding or sense of why it hadn't been set up earlier than 1989?
Not really. I think it was my understanding. And I'm not sure I have a good evidence base for this understanding, but it was a result of some disquiet over the processes that were in place during the implementation of HIV testing in blood, because it wasn't a straightforward process, and there were multiple organisations involved in policy making and so on, and as with so many things in government, it took them a few years to actually find the solution to this, which was to create an advisory committee whose purpose was to advise ministers on this.
And it's right to understand, I think, that was precisely its role. You would advise, when I say you, the committee would advise the Department of Health through, I think there's a suggestion in one of the documents, it would go first to the Chief Medical Officer, but leave that aside, and then for ministers to take the final decisions.
Maybe it's the passage of time, but I'm not sure I know of the precise mechanism. It was certainly an advisory committee to advise ministers. Whether the decisions and the considerations were passaged through the Department of Health, I'm not sure. But it was always chaired by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, so it was a very senior official within the Department of Health. And indeed, the 4 territorial countries, as they were called, had representation on the committee as observers.
Now, around the same time, there was another committee formed, which was the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases. What was your understanding of the different roles or respective roles and remits of the two bodies?
Well, the ACVSB was set up to advise ministers on policy, and I think that was emphasised. Its stated aim was not to get involved in detailed operational issues, however important these were matters for the professional services, the blood services and public health organisations to deal with. An ACDTTD, the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Disease, was set up within or amongst the 4 blood services in the UK to consider those operational details, but also to advise the ACVSB on particular issues. And Dr. Gunson, who chaired the ACTTD, sat on both committees, so there was overlap. But it was always reinforced at the meetings that I went to of ACVSB and also MSBT that it was their role to create policy and to decide policy, not the ACTTD. So there was a little tension between the 2 committees, but they worked very well together overall.
Now, you told the Penrose inquiry when you gave evidence on this topic that the agendas for ACVSB meetings would be put together by the Department of Health Secretariat. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we can just pick up your Penrose evidence at PRSE 0006068, please. If we go to page 116, this is evidence given in November 2011. So page 116, please, Sally. Bottom of the page, you say this: it was always the case at these meetings that Dr. Metters, he was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, I think, who took over from Dr. Harris, who chaired the first 3 meetings.
Yes, that's right.
Always emphasised that the views of the committee were advisory. It was an advisory committee and it didn't have the final say. So it always carried the caveat that ministers may or may not agree. And that was your understanding at the time? That
was my understanding at the time, yes.
And then, if we just go by way of example...
I can't actually recall any instance where a carefully worked out strategy or policy presented to ministers was rejected. I think by and large, at least in 99% of the time, the advice was accepted.
Now, if we can go to the minutes of the second meeting, which was 22nd of May 1989, and that's NHBT 0005019, please. We see there the membership of the committee. So we've got still Dr. Harris here before Dr. Metters takes over. We've then got a number of members listed, yourself included, a number of names familiar to the inquiry: Professor Zuckerman, Dr. Tedder, Dr. Tuddenham, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Mortimer, Dr. Lane, Dr. Minor, who I think represented NIBSC.
Yes, he was a well-known and respected virologist at NIBSC.
And then we have the Secretariat, Dr. Raymond, Mr. Canavan, so they're from the Department of Health. And then we have observers, of whom I think on the left-hand side, the observers, Dr. Pickles, Dr. Rotblatt, Dr. Purves, are from the Department of Health.
Dr. Pickles was from the Department of Health. Dr. Rotblatt was a medical assessor for the Medicines Control Agency, and Dr. Purves was a pharmaceutical assessor for the Medicines Control Agency.
And then the other three observers we have listed represented Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I might have got the Northern Ireland and Wales the wrong way around. I'll need to double check.
Yes, Dr. McIntyre was the Scottish representative, and I think Dr. George was the Northern Ireland representative, and Dr. Flett perhaps from Wales, but I can't be sure.
Now, you said in your Penrose, or it was put to you in your evidence to the Penrose inquiry, and you agreed, looking back, that there may have been insufficient public health expertise or perspective in terms of the membership of the ACVSB. Is that right?
This was in a briefing note I supplied to Professor Cash, wasn't it? Is that where that came from? Or is it in my evidence?
It's in your evidence.
Okay.
I think if we go to PRSC
Yes.
0006068.
That's it on the screen, I think.
No, PRSC
Oh,
0006068. Oh, my screen still has the minutes.
HBT 5019 is on
Yeah.
the screen, I think.
I don't have the transcript on the screen. Thank you. Page 137. I should perhaps just pick it up on the previous page, 136, just so that we can see the context in which you then give an answer. So Professor James, in the Penrose inquiry,
Yes, yeah.
Explores with you issues about the composition of the committee. He says he suggests it didn't contain enough sharp-end transfusionists. Only they were outnumbered by strong-minded and authoritative virologists, for example. So that the committee might have paid rather more cognizance in that important period in 1990, in particular at the beginning of 91, to the virology as against the public health / needs of the screening service. And then I just wanted to remind you of your answer, which is the top of the next page. You say, I think I agree with your analysis to an extent. The reason I was hesitating was because this was something that I considered before I wrote my statement. I thought composition of the committee was, perhaps with hindsight, unduly biased to the science. The expert virologists, who are very authoritative people, I have to say this, it is not a criticism of them, but standing back and perhaps 20 or 30 years on, the public health perspective was not as dominant in fact as it possibly could have been. And does that remain your view, again, looking back?
Yes, I think it does. That is, well, I would just underline, this is not a criticism of the virologist, but it seemed to me that the best became the enemy of the good, as it were, as the expression goes, that they were searching for perfect outcomes rather than good outcomes that could meet a public health need, and that was, for me, that came to the fore when data was presented that said the first generation hepatitis C antibody test would have picked up 60% of HCV positive donors And I thought that's just on that basis alone, that was a reasonable justification for implementing the phase 1 test rather than delaying it by a further year.
And then if we go to page 14, please, of this transcript. If I can pick it up from line 10 onwards, you were asked about the contribution of the Secretariat to the meetings. Did they contribute to meetings, those individuals? And your answer, yes, they were, certainly Dr. Raymond and Dr. Pickles. I'm trying to recall if there were others, and then you referred to Dr. Purvis. And then line 18, yes, periodically they were called upon specifically to report on a particular issue, but also took a full part in the discussions of the committee. So that's your recollection of the role of the Department of Health Secretariat, that they weren't simply there to put together the agenda and take a note. They participated actively in the discussions.
No, they had quite senior medical officers from the Department of Health that were part of the committee. They weren't full members of the committee, but then it wasn't a voting committee. It didn't used to vote on issues and so on. There was a process that I never really understood what the detail was, and we would have the discussions and at the meeting, and then those discussions will get taken away to the Department of Health for further consideration, and perhaps a revised position might come back from the Department of Health for consideration. So they were very much an integral part of the process, as far as I recall.
And then you continue. I think that was probably less the case with the Welsh, the Northern Irish and the Scottish departmental representatives, who tended to be, as they were described there, more observers than participants.
That's my impression, yes.
Now, confidentiality, I don't think we need to look at the minutes to see this, but in a number of the minutes record the chair, so the deputy CMO, emphasising the confidentiality of the proceedings. If we go on to page 16, please, I just want to pick up the way in which you put it in your Penrose evidence. At line 6, so your attention was drawn to the minutes referring to confidentiality, and then you said this. Yes, I think the minutes slightly understate what was actually said at the meeting. I remember this. There are a few moments in one's life that you do remember, and I think Ed Harris, who was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the time, did really underline and emphasise this point, almost threatening you with the Tower of London if you were to breach that confidentiality. So it was expected that members of the committee would keep what was being discussed absolutely confidential and secret.
That was certainly the message which was delivered very forcefully at the first meeting and subsequently underlined periodically. It wasn't reinforced vigorously at each meeting, but we were reminded that discussions were confidential, and if there was a particularly controversial topic or a topic with a very wide and active public health interest associated with it, which was controversial, then we were always advised that the discussions of the meeting should remain confidential. That was always a problem, of course, because some of the discussions had really quite short-term impacts on the work of the transfusion services. So I think I did find ways of communicating some points of information that I gleaned from the meeting to senior colleagues, but it was never a satisfactory process. The minutes were never released to a wider audience.
And you say later in your Penrose evidence, I don't think we need to go to it, but it's this same transcript at page 141. You said there was undue emphasis on this, that's the confidentiality requirement, for reasons which were never really clear. Is that right? Sorry, it's a different page, I can take you to it. Page 141, please, Sally. Bottom of the page, line 21. So you were being asked about confidentiality, and you say, I think there was undue emphasis on this for reasons which were never really clear. So is that right? It was never really explained to you as a member why there was this requirement of confidentiality?
Well, I think the world was generally much more confidential then, and perhaps less transparent than it's required to be now. But periodically it did concern me that some of the issues that were being discussed I knew would be very important to those planning the work of the transfusion services back in the regional transfusion centres in Scotland, which I knew more about than England, of course. So, yes, it did concern me, but the process as prescribed by the committee was that nothing could be said to anybody until the formal position had been solidified and approved and so on.
And can I suggest to you for your comment two problems that might arise as a consequence of the requirement of confidentiality? The first, which I think you've already alluded to, is that it means you as a member of the committee or any of the other members of the committee could not report back to others and share with them information which might be highly relevant to what others are doing.
Yes.
Or might need to know.
Or equally, because I was a representative, effectively, I was on the committee because I was part of the SNBTS. But equally, colleagues from SNBTS could inform my views much more substantially if I knew there was a particular topic on the agenda. But I couldn't go to them and say, this particular topic is coming up on the agenda. Can you please brief me?
Well, I think that essentially picks up on what I was going to suggest was the second problem.
I think I found ways of managing around that, but it was a constraint, yes.
Because if you have minutes that are publicly accessible and can be shared, it means that those who are not the 8, 9 or however many members of the committee,
Sure.
But who might have a great deal of informed opinion and expertise to bear, they're not in a position to influence or inform or shape the decision making, are they?
No.
Because they simply don't know what's being considered and why.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I think to be fair to the process, I think it as the years passed, it loosened up a little in terms of ability to communicate outside the committee on particular issues.
Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm not going to take you through each of the meetings. I'm going to just read the references and the dates for the meetings so they're collected in one place on the transcript. And then I just want to take you to just a handful of observations you made either to Penrose or in your statement to this inquiry about the decision-making process on hepatitis C screening. So the dates of the meetings and their URNs are as follows. First meeting from April 1989 is NHBT 000041_003. Second meeting, 22nd of May 1989, NHBT 0005019. Third meeting, 3rd of July 1989, NHBT 0000072_025. And then fourth meeting, 6th of November 1989, NHBT 0005043. Fifth meeting, 17th of January 1990, PRSE 0001477. Sixth meeting, 24th of April 1990, NHBT 0000072_098. Seventh meeting, 2nd of July 1990, PRSE 0000976. Eighth meeting, 21st of November 1990, NHBT 0000073_018. Ninth meeting, 25th of Feb 91, PRSE 0002280. And then 10th meeting, 21st of May 91, NHBT 0000042_080. Now, obviously, meetings continued after that date, but those are the meetings at which the issue of hepatitis C screening were considered. So can I then come to just a number of general matters about the decision-making process? First of all, it appears to have been understood that the ultimate decision on hepatitis C screening was going to be a decision for the Department of Health or the Secretary of State for Health.
Departments of Health.
So for the 4 departments,
yes,
is that your understanding?
Yes.
But it was a government decision in any event.
I think so, and the DOH, the English Department of Health, would have
been
very much in the lead. Yes.
And that the question both of whether to introduce screening, when to introduce screening, and was going to be a matter centrally determined in that way.
That's my understanding of the process, yes. Yeah.
Was that just taken as read, as it were? Because it might be said there was actually no real obstacle to individual transfusion services taking their own decision. They were autonomous bodies funded in Scotland by the CSA, funded in England and Wales by their regional health authorities. They didn't require the permission legally of the departments of health.
I can't comment on the legal aspects, but what I could say at the outset of both HIV testing and hepatitis C testing, there was a fairly consensual view that a single date for implementation of testing was desirable to avoid the situation where one hospital in a particular region was testing and another hospital was receiving untested blood. I think it would have caused really quite serious concerns and problems, not least amongst patients, starting to choose hospitals or where they would have their transfusion according to whether they were testing for hepatitis C. So I think there was amongst the professionals there was no dissent from the notion that it should all be done on a single date. I think the problem in Scotland arose when I think colleagues in Scotland felt that this process was being delayed over and over again for no good reason. For us in Scotland, because all the systems were in place, the funding was in place, the expertise was there, the counselling algorithms for the donors was all in place, and there was very serious concern expressed by the then general manager, Mr. McIntosh, that actually we should be implementing this. Our line of accountability is to the Secretary of State for Scotland. That was always his argument, but. I think SHHD came back and said, no, this is a UK-wide decision.
Now, one of the matters which I think I know you're now aware of, because you refer either in your Penrose evidence or your evidence to the inquiry to having read the judgment of Mr. Justice Burton in National Blood Authority. So you will know now that a number of other countries introduced hepatitis C screening significantly earlier in some cases than the United Kingdom did. And the judgment lists the dates for various different countries, starting, I think, with Japan in November '89. There's some reference in the ACVSB minutes from time to time to the position in other countries. Do you recall that being a focus of discussion, or anyone asking the question, well, look, the States have done it, Australia's done it, France has done it, Finland's done it, Canada's done it, why aren't we doing it?
I think it was discussed. I can't remember the specific conversations. I can certainly remember a point in time at one of the meetings, I think it would have been in 1990, where we learnt that the phase 1 product, phase 1 testing system, had been implemented in many countries, including USA, France, Finland, and so on. And whatever problems were considered to remain in the UK, many other countries, not dissimilar to ourselves, had managed to resolve these. So my view was, although I was not an expert virologist, my view was if they can resolve these issues and still implement the test system, then even with only a 60% specificity rate, then there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't do that. So that was my evolving view. But it was discussed, but perhaps not at the top of the agenda.
And then if I can just pick up another general observation you made at PRSE 00006068. So this is back in your oral evidence, page 50. Now, you were here, I think, you were taken through during your Penrose evidence a number of the sets of minutes for the ACVSB. I'm not going to replicate that process. I think you were here commenting upon the November 89 meeting, but really interested in whether this is a more general observation. At line 10, you say this. You talk about your recollection being Dr. Metters was very anxious that the policy decision should not be taken until it was absolutely clear that all the various details associated with the test had been resolved. And then you go on to say, line 17, that you thought fairly on in the process there could have been a point earlier where the Department of Health, and then I think there might be some words missing, but it talks about the testing would go ahead. And then top of the next page, I think you're contrasting at the top of the next page Dr. Gunson's position, urging the government to make a policy decision with the position of the Department of Health, taking what you describe in line 5 as a slightly less enthusiastic view. Leaving aside the particular meeting in question, is that a general theme that ran through it? Reluctance or anxiety on the part of Dr. Metters that all the details had to be got right before the bigger decision could be taken?
From my perspective, that's a reasonable view. I took the view, I think there were 3 conditions that were established during the work up to implementation of hepatitis C that had to be satisfied. One was FDA licensure of the test system, because they license diagnostic tests in the US. Satisfactory operational experience of the transfusion services, and a suitable confirmatory test. And much earlier than September 1991, those conditions had been satisfied.
And then if I can just, to conclude this topic, go to your witness statement of this inquiry, so WITN 6920001. And if we can go to page 146, please, Sully. 146. So if we can pick it up towards the bottom of the page, paragraph 458, I'm just going to read what you say and then ask if you have any further comments. You say this: in brief summary, I believe there were a number of shortcomings in the overall UK management process, ultimately leading to a relatively late implementation of HCV testing in Scotland and throughout the UK. These included 1, unnecessary secrecy and confidentiality associated with the considerations of ACVSB and other behind-the-scenes discussions. 2, absent or confused processes for communication of ACVSB decisions to operational managers. 3, a late recommendation in principle, in my view, by ACVSB and DOH for the introduction of HCV testing. This appeared to be driven primarily by scientific rigour rather than urgent public health considerations. And then if we go to the top of the next page, please, Sally. 4, the apparent absence of a clear plan, timescale, strategy or policy guidance from either DOH or SHHD for the introduction of testing, following the decision in principle by ACVSB in July 1990 to introduce testing. 5, the progressive and largely unexplained deferral of the UK start date from April to July to September 1991, believed to have been caused at least in part by administrative and funding issues between the English services and DOH rather than operational readiness. 6, with hindsight and given its readiness, both operational and financial, to introduce testing in early 1991, the failure of SNBTS to robustly argue a case for earlier introduction of testing in Scotland with SHHD/Scottish ministers, including the public health consequences of delays. Equally, an SHHD apparent reluctance to consider such an option, preferring instead to be guided exclusively by timescales determined by DOH. Now, you've set out in your Penrose evidence some more detailed observations by reference to the various stages of the decision-making process. And as I say, I'm not going to repeat those. But does that represent your considered view now as someone who was a member of the ACVSB and involved in the contemporaneous decision-making.
Yes, I think those observations, which are my personal observations, there may be others that disagree with some of those issues, but from my perspective, they seem to be the main problems that emerged from the rather turbulent period during 1989 to 1991 when it was eventually implemented. In particular, there were important meetings that were held in SMBTS, and they were quite robust discussions about what Scotland should be doing. And I certainly remember that the then general manager felt very, very passionately that Scotland was ready to go, so it should go. But SHHD flatly refused, I think, is the best way of expressing it, to entertain such an event.
So, just noting the time, I've probably got another, I think, only 5 to 10 minutes of my own questions for Dr. Perry.
Then let's go ahead with them, shall we?
Thank you, and then we can perhaps break and have the opportunity for core participants to suggest any further questions. So we can take that down. Thank you, Sally. Just wanted to ask you next about your involvement in the Better Blood Transfusion Programme, 2005 to 2007. Can you just tell us what in broad terms that entailed, what the objective was of the Better Blood Transfusion Programme in Scotland?
I think I can, yes. The Better Blood Transfusion Programme, its slogan was right blood, right patient, right time. It was about getting the appropriate prescription of blood transfusion, making sure the right blood was transfused to the right patient, because that was always an issue. Many of the adverse reactions associated with transfusion were associated with mismatched blood or the wrong blood going to the wrong patient and so on. So it was about clinical practice, about actual delivery of blood transfusion in a safe and appropriate way. But I think it also reflected the increasing observation that one of the most effective ways of reducing the risk of blood transfusion was to reduce the use of blood in inappropriate situations. So if you could eliminate the use of 10% of the blood used in a particular procedure, then you are at a stroke reducing the risk by 10%, and that seemed to be an important reward. So that process was put in place. The Better Blood Transfusion Programme had a number of elements to it, including one of the major elements was training, building training programs for specialist nurses to go out and deliver training to nurse practitioners and in hospitals and so on, and to haematology departments. Another aspect of the program was data collection to better understand how blood was being used. So the Better Blood Transfusion Programme was really only about blood components. It was nothing to do with plasma products.
No, I understand.
So it was primary. So one of the key targets was understanding how much blood was being used for a hip replacement or a knee replacement or a standard high blood using procedure. Because until you've got that and we're able to feed that back to practicing doctors, it was very difficult to control demand or to ensure appropriate demand. So it sort of built as a peer review system, and I think the people that use blood most extensively, certainly in the surgical area, were quite interested in these data, because they would look at it and say, well, I'm using twice as much blood as my colleague. And there was no data before that on that particular topic. So the SMBTS set up what it thought was and I still think today is still a very important programme.
And was that set up in 2005 when you became involved, or had it been running before that? No,
it was set up before then.
Do you know when it was initiated in Scotland?
No, probably about 2000, maybe 2001. Dr. McClelland was closely involved in this programme.
Then, can I ask you then to look at two documents, two separate unrelated documents. The first is LOTH 000045_002. LOTH 5045_002. This is a letter 11th of November 1991 from you to Professor Cash. It picks up on a letter that Dr. Foster had written to Professor Cash on the 5th of November, expressing some concerns about what Dr. Ludlam had said at a meeting. And we looked at the letter with Dr. Foster when he gave his evidence. I just want to ask you about what you say here. You say in the second line, I share Peter's disappointment at the presentational aspects of Christopher's talk. His comments seem to provide no useful purpose and have only served to undermine our claims of a unique and constructive relationship with our customers. Perhaps of more concern is the effect of such public statements at a time when HIV infection of haemophiliacs is very much under continued public scrutiny. Indeed, a central feature of our own position with regard to the tragedy of HIV is the early introduction of heat treatment and other measures such as batch dedication. The scientific value of these measures cannot and will not be proved, but they were introduced as a collective response, including haemophilia directives in 1984. And then it's this sentence I wanted to ask you about, please, Dr. Perry. I think the public denial of the value of these actions should be carefully considered, lest we undermine our collective security on this issue. What does that mean, undermining our collective security on this issue?
I'm not sure. I think I think I was referring to. I can't remember the detail of this little transaction that occurred, but the source of it was Dr. Foster attending a lecture given by Professor Ludlam, where I think his view was quite clear view that Dr. Ludlam had minimised the importance of the actions that we took in response to HIV. He wasn't criticising them. He was simply, I think. I might be thinking about another thing now, but he sort of described the early PFC's product as gentle warming, for instance, and I think
you're correctly remembering.
Is that a correct reference? Yes, and I think Peter's view and certainly mine, underscored by this letter, was that making such statements were not helpful to the SMBTS or indeed for patients either. So I think it was a concern about, this was a specific concern about the presentation.
And then if we can look at WITN 3431004, this is an email exchange between you, Dr. Foster and Dr. Douglas in July 2000 in the context of the Lindsay inquiry in Ireland. Can we look at the bottom of the page first of all? So we see at the bottom an email from you to Drs. Douglas and Foster, 20th of July. Have just heard that Terry Snape is acting as expert witness in the tribunal. I think we need to take steps to ensure there is no major conflict between our report of events, which will soon be in the public domain, and what Terry is planning to say. He's already provided written witness statement. I'll contact him. And then if we go up a little, we see Dr. Foster emailed you back saying, although it would be useful to learn what Terry has provided, it's always possible that different experts will have different opinions. I don't think we should interfere with Terry or ask him to change his statement, should there be any differences between us, nor should we change ours to fit a BPL view. And I won't read out the rest of the email, but he continues. And then if we go to the top of the page to your response, you say, I disagree slightly, not because I do not trust the competence of the tribunal to make decisions based on different witness statements, but because the tribunal is a public process in which perceived differences can be exploited by media and other interested parties. I'm not interested in spinning the two statements together or ensuring the detail is identical, but I am interested in seeing that our respective positions are consistent. And then you say you think it would help the tribunal if any major conflicts/differences were dealt with beforehand. Why were you keen to avoid inconsistency between the picture that might be painted by the evidence of Dr. Snape and any evidence that might be presented to the tribunal from Dr. Foster or others within SNBTS?
I don't really know. I can answer that. I certainly wasn't aware of any major problems, but I think I took the view that although Dr. Foster and Dr. Snape were both there in their personal capacities attending the tribunal, they were in a sense representing SNBTS and BPL, or at least a UK-wide position. So I think both for the purposes of the tribunal itself, I thought it would be useful. It would be useful if there was consistency between the two statements. I think in the outcome of this short exchange was no action was taken by anybody.
Yes. Was it the case that you were keen to avoid there being public criticism of SNBTS?
No. I think it was well. Yes, if that criticism was based on an unclear comparison between England and Scotland, for instance. So yes, I was concerned that there could be criticism, but as I think my statement really is as it is. I was definitely not interested in spinning the two statements together or trying to influence the outcomes. Dr. Foster is very able and competent, and Dr. Snape was very able and competent, but they were, in a sense, Dr. Foster reported to me, and he was representing the environment in which I was operating. So I, at that time, on that day, I felt I had a legitimate interest in what he might be saying and what Dr. Snape might be saying.
We can take that down, thank you, Sally. Just one final question then, for now, Dr. Perry. A theme of your evidence, in particular yesterday when we were looking at self-sufficiency, was the importance of minimising the use of commercial concentrates in Scotland, because commercial concentrates were seen as risky products in terms of viral transmission. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Do you think that may have led to a sense of, or a degree of complacency within SNBTS and PFC, that the domestic product was safe, as opposed to the domestic product being less risky than commercial concentrates?
I don't think that was a conclusion that we drew. I think certainly after, as we've discussed this morning, the publications by people like Peter Kernoff and so on, which demonstrated that UK products from voluntary donors still had the capability of transmitting virus to patients, and they did. There was certainly not a view in my mind, or indeed other people's minds, that the products were necessarily safer with respect to non-A, non-B, although there was still a belief that the severity of disease in the acute phase was lower and the duration of disease was lower and so on. Where I think that changed dramatically was with the advent of AIDS, where I think there was a very clear view then that SNBTS and indeed UK products and indeed voluntary products based on the voluntary donor principle were almost certainly going to be safer in terms of the number of virus-infected donations entering a plasma pool. And I think all the data that's come out from that particular period in terms of incidence of AIDS and incidence of HIV in plasma donors and so on bears that out. So it certainly, but it didn't make us complacent. It reinforced the view that the SNBTS products and indeed BPL products were going to be safer, but not safe.
So those are the questions or topics I'm proposing to cover with Dr. Perry. But we now need to give an opportunity to call participants to suggest any further issues arising out of Dr. Perry's evidence. So,
Do you have any sense of how long a period of break you might need?
I don't know, but I think it's probably safe to ask for half an hour.
Well, if I were to suggest not before 4:15.
I think that will be sufficient. Thank you, sir.
So let me explain to you, Dr. Perry. You may have heard me say this before, I don't know, but I'll say it again anyway. Those who are represented as core participants have the right through their representative to ask council to put questions to you. Many will have been watching online. Those questions may not yet have been formulated, though people may have been thinking about them. Council must have a chance to collect those questions, consider them, and then put the substance of them to you in due course. It takes time. That time is very usefully spent having a cup of tea, and so we'll take a tea break now and come back at 4:15.
Thank you.